Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Thanksgiving has always been an awkward balancing act in our family, a yearly performance where everyone smiles too wide, drinks too much boxed wine, and pretends that years of subtle resentment can be smothered under gravy and cranberry sauce. But this particular Thanksgiving, felt different from the second I stepped into the house. There was this electric, artificial cheer in the air, something brittle in the way everyone greeted each other, like the happiness was too rehearsed, too practiced, like someone was hiding a surprise behind their back and barely keeping it together. And they were. God, were they ever. I should have seen it coming. The way my mom kept glancing toward Madison like she was a child holding onto a secret she couldn't wait to spill. The way Madison kept adjusting her hair, her ring finger flashing more than usual, tapping her wine glass with little flourishes like she needed us to notice her hand. But I was distracted, I guess, already tired before the turkey hit the table, already worn down by the performance I knew I'd have to give. I didn't expect it to sting the way it did, though, not when she stood up mid-dinner, cleared her throat like she was about to deliver the State of the Union, and held out her left hand like it was some kind of golden trophy. "I have an announcement," Madison said, beaming so hard I thought her face might crack from the effort. "Ryan and I are engaged." For a moment, everything in the room just froze. Forks paused midair, glasses hung halfway to mouths, and the air seemed to suck itself right out of the room. It was like time stalled just long enough for everyone to turn and look at me, just a flicker, just a heartbeat, but long enough to burn itself into my memory. Then came the explosion of cheers. My mother practically launched herself out of her chair to embrace Madison like a soldier returning from war, tears already springing to her eyes as she clutched her like she'd just won a damn prize. "Oh, honey," she gushed, voice trembling with excitement, "he finally chose the right one." That line, those exact words, hit me harder than I thought words could. Not just the implication, not just the absolute erasure of everything that came before, but the certainty in her voice, like it was obvious, like it was the ending we were all supposed to celebrate. I felt my stomach turn cold, like someone had poured a bucket of ice water down my spine. I smiled. I smiled like my face was made of porcelain, like I hadn't heard what I just heard, like I hadn't once loved that man, hadn't once planned a life with him, hadn't once laid in bed next to him and believed I mattered. I smiled politely, the way I'd been trained to. I clinked my glass against hers and said, "Congratulations," even though every inch of me was screaming. And Ryan sat there across from me with that same smug expression he'd always worn when he thought he'd gotten away with something, like he was daring me to say something, to make a scene, to shatter the little storybook moment unfolding around us. I didn't. Not yet. But the thing is, when you've spent your whole life being the second choice, the backup plan, the one people forget to ask about, you learn how to hide things. You learn how to tuck your rage behind polite smiles, how to bury your pain in small talk and casserole dishes. You learn how to play the long game. And me? I'm nothing if not patient. Funny thing is, this wasn't even the first betrayal I'd swallowed for the sake of peace. Growing up, it was always Madison who got the attention, the praise, the hand-me-down compliments about how pretty and graceful and put together she was. I was the smart one, the practical one, the she'll land on her feet girl. No one ever considered I might want more than just to land. I wanted to fly. But when you grow up with a sister like Madison, there's not much room left in the spotlight. She took up all the oxygen in the room, and Mom let her. When I started dating Ryan 3 years ago, it was the first time I thought maybe I could have something for myself. He wasn't perfect, God knows that now, but at the time, he made me feel seen. He'd listen when I spoke, ask questions about my work, hold my hand under the table at family dinners when Mom made her usual backhanded compliments. But that didn't last. Slowly, he started pulling away, missing plans, forgetting small things, growing colder by the week. When he finally ended things, he used that same line my mother always did. "You're great, but I think Madison and I just connect better." That should have been a red flag waving in my face, a flare shot into the sky. But I was still stuck on what I'd lost, still wondering what I'd done wrong, still believing it was something lacking in me. And now, here he was, smiling across the table, sitting next to the woman who had always taken everything I'd wanted before I even knew I wanted it. But as I lifted my wine glass again, letting the artificial laughter echo around me, I caught Ryan's eyes across the table. And in that brief second, something flickered there, something small and uneasy, like a crack in the surface of his smug little expression. Because I wasn't just smiling politely anymore. No, I was smiling because I knew something no one else did yet. I knew that in my purse, zipped up safely next to my car keys, sat a voicemail from Ryan. A voicemail he'd left me 2 weeks ago when he was drunk and nostalgic and definitely still mine in all the ways he tried to pretend he wasn't. And when I played it, nobody at that table would be celebrating anymore. There's a certain kind of invisibility that doesn't come from being small or quiet or forgettable, but from simply being the wrong kind of daughter, the kind who's never quite graceful enough, never quite charming enough, never quite delicate in the way that mothers seem to adore. That was me. I was the practical one, the reliable one, the steady hand in a house that only ever seemed to applaud sparkle. And Madison, well, she was the sparkle. From the moment we were old enough to be compared, she was the favorite. She didn't have to earn it, didn't have to do anything extraordinary. She just existed, and somehow that was enough. People would say she was radiant, poised, effortlessly magnetic, like she was touched by something special. But what they didn't say out loud was that every compliment she received was a reminder of what I wasn't. I remember being 14, sitting in the living room in my best dress, nervously clutching a school award I'd won for a science fair project I had poured months into. I had been so proud, so desperate for someone to notice. My mother glanced at the certificate once, nodded politely, and then turned her attention back to Madison, who had just walked in with a new haircut. "Oh, look at you," she gushed, reaching out to touch the ends of Madison's perfectly styled curls. "You look like a movie star." I stood there, invisible, my award still clutched in my hand, the silence around my small achievement louder than anything I'd ever heard. That dynamic never really changed. Madison was the one they took pictures of at holidays, the one whose heartbreaks were treated like national emergencies, the one who could do no wrong no matter how many wrongs she actually did. Meanwhile, I became the fixer, the one who picked up the pieces after Madison's messes, the one who soothed our mother's nerves when Madison disappeared for a weekend with some bad decision in a leather jacket. I was the one who packed lunches, wrote thank you notes, managed the details of a family that only noticed me when something needed to be done. By the time we were in our 20s, the divide between us had become so deeply entrenched that it no longer surprised me. Madison floated through life on charm and soft smiles, getting job offers she didn't deserve, dates she didn't value, compliments she didn't earn. I worked late, paid my bills, built a career brick by brick with no applause and no fanfare. And every time I brought someone home to meet the family, it was Madison they noticed. Always Madison. Even Ryan, apparently. But before Thanksgiving, before the ring, before the champagne toast, before my mother's little dagger of a compliment, something else happened. Something I hadn't told anyone. Something that still sat in my chest like a hot coal I couldn't put out. It happened 2 weeks before that damn dinner, late on a Friday night after too many drinks and too much unresolved history. Ryan had called me out of nowhere, his name lighting up my screen like a ghost I hadn't invited but couldn't ignore. I should have ignored it. God, I should have ignored it. But I didn't. I answered. He said he missed me. Said he didn't know what he was doing. Said he'd been thinking about me more than he wanted to admit. And then, because I'm human and broken and still tethered to something I hadn't fully let go of, I said yes when he asked if he could come over. One drink turned into two. One conversation turned into a kiss. One kiss turned into a night that should have never happened, but did anyway. The next morning, we didn't talk about it. He left early, mumbling something vague and forgettable, like he was trying to erase the night before it could imprint too deeply. But 2 days later, he left me a voicemail, drunk again, this time slurring words and spilling truths I didn't ask for. He said he was scared. Said he wasn't sure about Madison. Said I'd always known him better, loved him better. Said that sometimes he thought he'd made a huge mistake. I hadn't told a soul about that night or that voicemail. I hadn't planned to. But now, sitting in my childhood dining room surrounded by people clinking glasses and congratulating my sister for stealing the one person I had ever felt truly connected to, I could feel that voicemail like a weight in my pocket. It was burning through the fabric of my coat, whispering from inside the silence I wore on my face. Maybe I was supposed to let it go. Maybe I was supposed to swallow it down like every other moment I'd been told to be the bigger person. But I could feel something inside me shifting slowly, steadily, like tectonic plates grinding into motion. I wasn't the pretty one. I wasn't the chosen one. I wasn't the one anyone toasted. But I was the one with the truth. And truth, no matter how quietly it waits, always has a way of making itself heard. There is a strange, almost surreal kind of heaviness that settles in when you're sitting at a table surrounded by people who are too busy clinking glasses and telling each other how happy they are to notice the thick tension slicing through the room like a wire pulled tight and humming. Madison was practically glowing across from me, her hand waving in slow, exaggerated gestures to make sure the light hit that diamond just right, turning her finger into some kind of spotlighted centerpiece as if she were presenting a crown instead of a ring. Every time she lifted her glass, every time she reached for another helping of potatoes or adjusted her napkin, she made sure it caught everyone's attention, like this ring was some kind of symbol of victory rather than what it really was. A prize claimed out of spite or insecurity, or maybe just for sport. The family responded exactly the way I expected they would, the way they always did when Madison did anything remotely worth applauding, or even when she did absolutely nothing. My aunt gushed over the clarity of the stone like she'd just come from working at a jewelry store. My cousin leaned across the table to snap photos of the ring for some family group chat I hadn't been added to in years. My mother, of course, looked like she'd just watched a royal coronation, beaming proudly as if Madison's engagement somehow validated every choice she'd ever made as a parent. It was a performance so thick with self-congratulation it was hard to breathe. Meanwhile, I just sat there, the air around me somehow colder despite the warmth of the house, the noise of the celebration buzzing faintly in my ears like a television left on in another room. No one asked how I was doing. No one noticed that my plate was barely touched, that I hadn't spoken more than a few sentences since dinner started, that I was gripping my wine glass so tightly I was starting to feel the stem imprint against my skin. But Ryan noticed. He noticed everything. Every few minutes, I'd catch his eyes drifting to me, quick glances at first, then longer stares that lingered too long to be innocent. And every time our eyes met, there was something there, not guilt, not exactly, but something flickering under the surface, something restless and unsure, like a thread unraveling behind his polished expression. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened when Madison leaned against him too sweetly, too deliberately. I could feel it in the way he shifted in his seat when I laughed, even if it was just at some offhand joke from across the table. That tension was growing between us like a secret that had learned how to breathe, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more alive it became. And then, slowly, I started noticing the other details, the tiny cracks in the illusion that had been so carefully painted over. I caught the way Madison watched me from the corner of her eye when she thought I wasn't looking, how her smile faltered just slightly when Ryan's gaze lingered on me a second too long. I heard snippets of whispered conversations between her and my mother in the kitchen, their voices low but sharp, with occasional glances toward the dining room. I overheard one of my uncles ask how long the two of them had been together, and Madison answered just a little too quickly, just a little too precisely, like she'd rehearsed the timeline and didn't want anyone digging too deep. The more I listened, the more it all started to unravel in my head, the puzzle pieces rearranging themselves with a kind of dreadful clarity. The way Madison had acted coolly distant toward me in the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving. The way Ryan had acted nervous when I mentioned coming home for the holiday. The way my mother had been oddly chipper in our last phone call, as if she already knew something she couldn't wait to throw in my face. And then there was that night, 2 weeks ago, when Ryan had pulled me close in the dark and whispered things that now seemed far more calculated than confused. "I still think about you," he had said. "Sometimes I wonder if we gave up too soon." At the time, I believed it. I wanted to believe it. But now, with him sitting beside Madison, nodding along to stories about wedding venues and flower arrangements, those words echoed in my head like a script he'd rehearsed before stepping into a role he didn't want to play. And yet, no one around us seemed to notice. Or maybe they did notice and chose not to say anything, because that's what families like mine do. We pretend until the pretending cracks open on its own. We don't confront the tension. We just dress it in holiday sweaters and pass the stuffing. But I wasn't pretending anymore. I was watching. I was listening. And the longer I sat at that table, the more I became convinced that Madison knew. Maybe not the exact details, maybe not everything that had happened between Ryan and me, but enough. Enough to smile through gritted teeth, to overcompensate with every loud laugh and every dramatic display of affection. Enough to know that something had happened, and that I had something she could never quite touch. That voicemail in my pocket was no longer just a secret, it was power. It was a slow-burning fuse waiting for a spark. And I could feel the moment approaching, the one where everything carefully arranged around us would come crashing down, not because I'd started a fire, but because they had handed me the match and dared me to use it. Sometimes, when your world starts shaking under your feet, you don't run to the loudest room, you disappear quietly into the smallest one. That's exactly what I did. I excused myself from the table with a forced smile, ignoring the way Madison was describing her dream honeymoon in some expensive coastal resort like she'd plucked it out of a bridal magazine. I walked slowly, deliberately, toward the bathroom down the hall, passing the hallway lined with family photos that hadn't included me since I was 22. There was a time I might have paused and studied those frames, searching for proof that I'd once belonged here. But not tonight. Tonight, I had something heavier on my mind, something pressing against my ribs, begging to be let loose. I needed space. I needed silence. I needed to hear it again, one more time, before I made a decision I couldn't take back. Once inside the bathroom, I locked the door, leaned against the sink, and pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands weren't shaking, not exactly, but they felt heavier than usual, like they were carrying more than just a piece of glass and plastic. The voicemail sat there in my inbox, innocuous and patient, a singled, on my screen that held the power to burn everything around me to ash. My thumb hovered above it for a moment, not from hesitation, but from the sheer weight of knowing what came next. And then I pressed play. Ryan's voice came through like smoke, low, slurred, and tinged with that unmistakable kind of late-night desperation that only calls you when it thinks the world's asleep. "Hey, it's me. I know I shouldn't be calling, but I've had a few drinks and I just need to say this somewhere." There was a pause, a deep exhale, the sound of his breath crackling against the receiver like wind through dead leaves. "I miss you. God, I miss you. I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. I'm supposed to be happy, right? I'm supposed to be planning a future, but all I keep thinking about is how none of it feels real." Another pause. A muffled noise in the background, maybe a car passing or a bottle being set down too hard. "I never got over you," he said. "I tried. I told myself it was just easier this way, that you and I were too complicated. But it wasn't you. It was me, and I was scared. And now I'm marrying Madison, and I swear to God, sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat thinking, what the hell am I doing? I don't love her, not like I loved you." There it was. The moment. The confession. The nail in the coffin. I let the rest of the voicemail play out, even though I knew every word by heart, even though it had already branded itself onto my bones the first time I listened to it. He rambled about how my family never liked us together, about how marrying Madison meant fewer questions, fewer fights, fewer complications. He said he felt like he was suffocating in a life that looked perfect on paper but felt hollow inside. And finally, with a sigh so thick it seemed to fog the speaker, he ended with, "I'm sorry. I think I made the wrong choice." When the message ended, the silence in the bathroom was deafening. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tiled floor, the faucet, the cracked corner of the mirror where someone had dropped something years ago and no one ever bothered to fix it. I felt like that crack, visible but ignored, part of the room but never repaired. And I wondered, Not for the first time. If exposing this message would make me feel whole again, or just confirm what everyone already suspected about me, that I was bitter, jealous, too hung up on things that didn't belong to me anymore. Because let's be honest, there's a risk in telling the truth, especially when people have already decided who you are in their story. And in this family, I've always been the one who takes things too personally, the one who can't just let things go, the one who stirs the pot when it's finally gone still. If I played that voicemail, it wouldn't just expose Ryan, it would make me the villain again, the petty ex-girlfriend who ruined a perfectly good Thanksgiving dinner out of spite. But wasn't that the whole problem? That everyone expected me to swallow betrayal with grace, to smile through heartbreak, to shrink myself smaller and smaller until I became so easy to ignore they forgot I could speak at all? I didn't owe anyone silence. I didn't owe anyone comfort. And maybe, just maybe, the truth wasn't petty, it was overdue. Still, I hesitated. I looked at myself in that cracked mirror and saw all the years I'd spent trying to be the good daughter, the quiet one, the one who kept peace by sacrificing her own. I saw the woman who once believed love meant never making waves, even if you were drowning under them. I saw someone who'd been lied to, discarded, replaced, and expected to clap when her replacement held up a ring. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, splashed water on my face, and stared at my reflection one last time. Maybe I wasn't ready to press play yet. But the decision was no longer about if, it was about when. Because I knew, in the deepest part of myself, that silence wouldn't protect me anymore. And whether they were ready or not, the truth was coming. When I returned to the table, everything looked exactly as I'd left it. Napkins neatly folded, silverware gleaming under the soft light, plates cleared, wine glasses refilled. And smiles so wide you'd think this family was auditioning for a commercial instead of sitting on the edge of something about to break wide open. But underneath all that polished presentation, I could feel it, the shift, the slow churning of tension rising just beneath the surface, the way Ryan's eyes flicked toward me a little too quickly, a little too often. As if he was trying to calculate just how much longer he had before it all slipped out of his hands. I eased into my chair, folding my hands in my lap and watching him over the rim of my glass as he laughed at something Madison said, even though the laugh came a half-second too late and didn't quite reach his eyes. Madison, of course, remained radiant, her voice growing louder with every compliment thrown her way, her gestures exaggerated just enough to make sure no one missed that ring as it sparkled with each movement. She was basking in the glow of it all, soaking up the spotlight like a flower desperate for sun, and for a moment I almost pitied her, because she didn't know that the light was about to burn everything down. I started small, just subtle nudges, quiet little comments slipped into the conversation like stray threads daring someone to tug on them. When someone asked Ryan how he proposed, I leaned in slightly and said, "Must have been quite the whirlwind. You two got serious so fast." His jaw tightened just enough for me to notice, but he kept his smile in place. Madison beamed as she launched into a rehearsed story about some winery and a hidden photographer, and I nodded politely, biting back the urge to roll my eyes. A few minutes later, when my uncle commented on what a perfect match they seemed to be, I tilted my head and said, "Funny, I remember when people used to say that about us, Ryan." Right? The table fell quiet for a fraction of a second before Madison forced a laugh, and my mother jumped in like she'd been waiting for her cue. "Oh, that was years ago," she said, waving a dismissive hand. Ryan and Madison are a much better fit. Some things just weren't meant to last. There it was, the jab, delivered with that same saccharine smile she'd perfected over the years, the same tone she used to tell me I wasn't trying hard enough or that I should learn to be more like my sister. I didn't flinch. I just smiled wider and nodded, letting the bitterness coat the back of my throat like cheap wine. As the dessert plates were brought out and someone lit candles on the pumpkin pie, I knew the moment had finally come. Everyone was gathered around now, leaning in close, wine loosening their tongues, laughter blooming too loud in the corners. Madison was mid-sentence, telling some story about their upcoming engagement party, when I cleared my throat softly and stood up from my chair. "I hope I'm not interrupting," I said, my voice steady, calm, even warm. but I have something I'd like to share." All eyes turned toward me, some curious, some confused, a few already wary. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone, tapping the screen as casually as if I were about to read off a recipe. Ryan's face drained of color in a way that told me everything I needed to know. He knew. Somewhere deep down, he had known this was coming. "I just thought it would be nice," I continued, still smiling, "to hear some heartfelt words tonight." I pressed play. The voicemail began to play through the speaker, and for the first few seconds, no one reacted. Maybe they didn't quite understand what they were hearing. But then Ryan's voice poured into the room, low and unmistakable, soaked in alcohol and regret. "I miss you. I don't love her, not like I loved you. I think I made the wrong choice." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating, curling around every corner of the room until it was impossible to pretend they hadn't heard exactly what they'd heard. The laughter died. The chatter stopped. Forks froze midair. My mother's hand, poised delicately with a knife mid-slice through the pie, stopped moving altogether, suspended in disbelief. Madison's face collapsed in real time, her smile flickering out like a candle caught in the wind. Her eyes darted to Ryan, then back to me, then to the phone still playing the damning message that had cracked open the carefully curated image she'd spent so long constructing. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was Ryan's voice, still droning on, confessing his confusion, his misery, his guilt, exposing every lie with the soft hum of background noise amplifying the humiliation with every second. And when it finally ended, when the last word faded and silence settled in like a thick fog, I slipped the phone back into my pocket, sat down, and took a sip of my wine. No dramatic monologue. No apologies. Just quiet satisfaction blooming in my chest like a long-held breath finally released. Sometimes, the loudest sound in the room isn't a voice, it's the silence that follows the truth. There are moments in life when the truth doesn't just speak, it detonates. The kind of truth that doesn't need a follow-up, doesn't wait to be explained, doesn't care if anyone is ready to hear it. And as I sat there in my chair, the remnants of Ryan's voice still echoing through the thick silence of that dining room, I knew the explosion had already happened, and nothing was going back to how it was before. Not the family, not the story, not the illusion. The glass had cracked, and now everything was splintering in its wake. It started slow, as these things often do. A cough from the end of the table, someone shifting uncomfortably in their seat, my aunt awkwardly adjusting her napkin as if that would somehow erase what we'd all just heard. Madison was the first to speak, but her voice didn't sound like it belonged to her anymore. It was shrill, shaky, unraveling by the second. "Is this some kind of joke?" she said, her eyes darting around the table like she was waiting for someone to tell her it wasn't real, that she hadn't just heard her fiancé confess his love for her sister. But no one said a word, because there wasn't a single person at that table who could deny what they'd heard. Ryan had stood frozen throughout the entire message, and now, with every eye slowly turning toward him, he finally pushed back from his chair, his hands trembling just enough for me to notice. He didn't try to deny it, didn't try to spin some excuse or apologize. He just stood there, looked at me for one long moment with something between anger and guilt written across his face, and then walked out the door without a word, leaving a trail of silence in his wake that settled over the room like a shroud. And then, of course, came the storm. Madison shot up from her chair, knocking it backward with a loud clatter that made everyone flinch. Her voice exploded into the room, high-pitched and ragged with fury, demanding answers that no one could give. "How long?" she screamed, her eyes wild, her mascara already beginning to smear beneath the weight of her tears. "How long were you sleeping with him? Was this just revenge? Was this your way of ruining my life?" I didn't answer right away. I just sat there, calm as a Sunday breeze, watching her fall apart with the kind of detachment that only comes after years of being pushed aside. "I didn't ruin anything," I said quietly, finally meeting her eyes. "I just stopped pretending." That's when my mother turned to me, her face twisted in something I couldn't quite name, part betrayal, part disbelief, but mostly that same old judgment she'd worn like a second skin for most of my life. "Why would you ruin this for her?" she said, and I could hear the real question underneath it. Why couldn't you just stay in your place? Why couldn't you just keep quiet and let her have her moment? And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. I didn't feel the usual pull of guilt or the impulse to defend my side of the story. I simply shrugged, a small gesture that somehow felt louder than anything I could have said. Maybe I did ruin it. Maybe I shattered the pretty little picture they were all so desperate to hang on the wall. Or maybe, just maybe, I finally stopped letting them write me out of my own story. The rest of the evening dissolved into chaos. Madison stormed out after Ryan, yelling something about betrayal and dignity, though I doubt either of them could even define those words at that point. My mother retreated into the kitchen, slamming cabinets and muttering to herself about ungrateful daughters and ruined holidays. The rest of the family awkwardly trickled out one by one, each offering me the kind of looks you give someone after a car crash, part pity, part curiosity, part relief that it hadn't happened to them. No one said goodbye to me. No one thanked me for dinner or asked how I was getting home or offered to help clean up. But I didn't care. I wasn't looking for gratitude or forgiveness or understanding anymore. I had spent my whole life trying to earn a seat at a table that was never really mine to begin with, and I was done begging for scraps. Eventually, I slipped out the back door, away from the mess, away from the clinking dishes and the rising voices and the suffocating weight of a family that had always seen me as an afterthought. The cold air hit my face like a cleansing slap, sharp and bracing and honest in a way that nothing inside that house had ever been. I walked down the steps, across the yard, past the rusted swing set that still creaked in the wind even though no one had used it in years. And as I stood at the edge of the driveway, I pulled out my phone one last time. I didn't play the voicemail again, didn't need to. I just held it in my hand, letting the quiet settle around me like a blanket stitched from every word I'd ever swallowed, every moment I'd ever bit my tongue, every time I'd let someone else's comfort come before my own truth. Maybe I wasn't the villain after all. Maybe I was just the only one who finally decided to stop pretending everything was fine. Maybe I was the only one telling the truth.